Great, well, I'm going to read now from Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 to 6, and then Chris will speak. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." Over to Chris.
Well, I suppose that the Sermon on the Mount is undoubtedly the most famous sermon that was ever given. Just for a moment as we start, I want you to try and picture those crowds that gathered to Jesus on that day that he delivered this sermon. I mean, it must have been the most talked about time for a long time. Jesus had been growing in fame by this stage in Matthew's Gospel, and the multitudes gathered to listen to what he had to say. One commentator put it like this: with beautiful simplicity, using terms that any age could understand, Jesus brought blessing rather than condemnation. Having endured a lifetime of verbal assaults by the scribes and Pharisees, the multitude on the mount must have thought that they had died and gone to heaven. Well, through the lunchtime talks, this term, and in fact this whole year, we're going to be really slowing down and considering the Sermon on the Mount for ourselves, dealing with as many details as we can, and of course pausing for application to think about what this sermon, delivered 2,000 years ago, means for us today, especially in the city. So with limited time, I'm going to suggest we dive straight in. Have a look at what I think is the key verse in this opening section, verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Now, of course, to hunger and thirst is something we can easily relate to. It means to greatly desire something. And more than anything, Jesus says to the gathered crowd, we should desire righteousness. Now, what that means is it should be the heartbeat of our life. It is the desirable attribute that Jesus says we should take and make our own. The Greek philosopher Socrates, he tells the story of a young man that came bounding up to him one day, eager to acquire knowledge. The story goes that Socrates took him to the river, which I think was nearby. And when they arrived at the river, the young man was plunged under the water by Socrates, not quite the thing that he wanted. He wanted to know knowledge. And he struggled to break free. And Socrates, the story goes, held him fast and wouldn't let him break free. The man struggled and gasped all the more. Finally, he did manage to get out of the sort of rather oppressive coffin of the water. And he broke free and he gasped. Socrates then said to the man, "When you thought you were drowning, what one thing did you want most of all?" Gasping for breath, the man said, "Air! I wanted air." And Socrates said, "When you want knowledge as much as you wanted air, then you shall have it." Let's apply this to the sermon. Have a look at verse 6 again. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they shall be satisfied. I think the real challenge of this first part of the sermon, Jesus is saying, make your deepest desire, your heart's longing for righteousness. Make that your desire. That and that alone, and then you shall be satisfied. Rolling Stones, eat your heart out. I think that's where we land today. And I'll say a little bit more about righteousness, because the problem with the Sermon on the Mount, the more you study it, the more you look at the details, the more questions that are raised. Well, what does that mean? I sort of get the idea. I can imagine being held under the water. What does that mean in practice? And we'll come to that. But let's just try and put the rest together, which I hope will then really make sense of that. A few points to see the significance. You see, Matthew starts by setting the scene in verses 1 to 2. So I'm going to follow his lead. Have a look again at verses 1 and 2. Seeing the crowds, Jesus went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and he taught them, saying. So, you'll see the first point on the handout there. Jesus ascends the mountain to inaugurate the final epoch of salvation history. Jesus ascends the mountain to inaugurate the final epoch of salvation history. Now, from the start of his gospel, Matthew has been at great pains to show that there is a connection between Jesus and Moses from many, many hundreds of years before. Lots of similarities between these two significant characters. And Matthew has been drawing our attention to those particular similarities. I'm just going to remind you of some of those now, which will help then to set the scene as this sermon begins. Help us to understand particularly the significance of the mountain, which I think is hugely significant. Let's start with the birth. Not many characters in the Bible are given much detail about their birth, but we get lots of detail with Jesus, lots of detail with Moses. You could say they both have big baby stories, Moses and Jesus. Straight after their birth, another similarity, both Moses and Jesus were threatened with death. If you know the story of Moses, Pharaoh's edict was chilling all Hebrew babies to be chucked into the Nile. Well, just after Jesus was born, what did Herod do? A rather chilling, equally chilling, I'd suggest, account, the annihilation of all the children in Bethlehem to try and get rid of Jesus. Then there is a connection with Egypt. They both had dramatic stories connected with Egypt. Moses, of course, had to flee from Egypt to save his life. Jesus had to flee into Egypt to save his life. Both go through periods of temptation in the wilderness. Both also go through significant periods of fasting for 40 days. And then both Moses and Jesus cross the River Jordan at significant times in their ministry. And so all of that is the backdrop. And so have a look at 5 verse 1 again. 5 verse 1, the mountain. The mountain suddenly stands out as much, much more relevant. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. The mountain was, of course, the place where Moses, many years before, had been given the law, the 10 Commandments. And not just the 10 Commandments, lots of supplementary teaching and detail. The law was what formed God's people. Moses, of course, was heralded as the redeemer of God's people, their deliverer, in a sense, bringing them salvation. And that was very obviously true as you look at the story of the Exodus. And now here is Jesus stepping on to the mountain. Not 10 commandments, but 10 beatitudes. Beautiful words accompanied by challenging teaching that last to eternity. And here is teaching to form God's people today. His new people. Christians. So do you see, as Jesus ascends the mountain, Matthew assumes that we've read chapters 1 to 4, that we've got that sort of in our minds, and that we've made those connections, all those connections with Moses. Do you see the significance of this? I mean, this is meant to build excitement. This is meant to build anticipation, almost to further the point. Have a look now at verse 2. I mean, Matthew really slows down with all of those connections, and he says, he opened his mouth and taught. It's a rather bizarre thing to say, isn't it? Of course he's going to have to open his mouth if he's going to teach. But it's like Matthew wants to focus all our attention on the fact that Jesus is now speaking. In Moses' day, God spoke to Moses. What did Moses do? Well, he wrote it down. Now, in Jesus' day, God's Son speaks directly to all those who are gathered. I mean, here he is. Here is the long-awaited King. The Messiah has stepped onto the pages of history, and he has come to inaugurate the next stage of salvation history. As Moses brought the law those many hundreds of years before, he, of course, brought a vital awareness of sin. And this piled up in the the children of Israel's minds and gave them a very clear understanding of sin. And as you go through the Old Testament, you see that sin becomes an increasing problem. It's sometimes described as a ticking time bomb. Sin is a serious problem. It's a serious problem. It is a bomb waiting to go off. No wonder the final word of the Old Testament, destruction. Well, what a contrast as Jesus now steps onto the mountain. The first word that he utters, blessing, hope, a new start is here. Martin Luther, the famous reformer, he puts it like this. Now that's a fine, sweet, and friendly beginning to this teaching and preaching. For he goes at it, not like Moses or a teacher of the law with commands and threats, but in the very friendliest way, but with nothing but attractions and allurements and lovely promises. There is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And that brings us to our second point. You'll see it there on the handout. Jesus opens the Sermon on the Mount by focusing on the true disciples' attitude of heart. I think that's really what this first section of teaching, these first 4 Beatitudes, is really about. It is the kingdom standard, the underlying attitude of heart. If we're going to take anything away from this today, that's what I'd love us to sort of go back to our offices or working on from home, wherever we are on Zoom. That's the one thing I'd love us all to be thinking about. I realize that to be talking about an underlying attitude raises a lot of questions. And we will have time to deal with that. Don't worry too much. We've got the whole academic year where we're going to really slow down and consider this sermon. And lots of the principles, the ways of reading it and applying it will keep coming back. So don't worry, we don't have to solve everything today. I will say just a few things. Let me just try to break down this opening section, the 10 Beatitudes. I think they split into 2 halves, and we're considering the first half today, these verses 3 to 6, the first 4 Beatitudes, the disciples' attitude. Next week, if you can join us, we're going to be considering the second part of the Beatitudes, verses 7 to 12, the disciples' conduct. And so the opening part of the sermon is dealing with, firstly, the disciples' attitude and then the disciples' conduct. Those are quite sort of manageable ideas to get our head around, aren't they? Who is the sermon for? Well, verse 1, we can see large crowds have gathered to listen to Jesus. But then also we get that detail, don't we, that's added in. The disciples gather. And so at a very simple level, I'd like to suggest that gives the sort of the framework for us to understand who this sermon is for. The disciple, the prototype believer, and then the crowd, the interested observer. And isn't that just going to be typical of any meeting where God's word is taught today? There will always be those who believe, disciples, and those who are prepared to give Jesus a hearing, the wider crowd. And that's who the sermon is, of course, aimed at. 9 times, Jesus repeats this word, blessed, blessed, blessed. It's all very well. It's all very well for Martin Luther to go on about these gentle, wonderful, sort of alluring words. But what does this word mean? Well, some translations, if you've got a sort of older version of the Bible, something like the King James, or even a modern translation of King James, will use the word happy. And that is a true and an accurate translation. The problem with the word happy is it can be quite a subjective word. Many in our world today will reduce the idea of happiness to nothing more than a sort of subjective feeling. One of the most helpful commentaries that I've found, having brought it down, I've now left it over there. Don't worry, it doesn't matter. It's a book by Jonathan Pennington. We don't actually sell it here. You have to buy it online anyway. Jonathan Pennington, he's wrote this book, and it's called The Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing. And it's called Human Flourishing because he says this word blessed equates to flourishing. And again, I think that's a very helpful way of summing up what it means to be blessed. It is to flourish. The problem is, I don't think we use the word flourish very well either. I think it's something we talk about in the garden, plants flourish, or maybe children at school flourish. I don't think we often talk about people flourishing in life as grown-ups. Maybe I just move in different circles. I don't know. Anyway, I don't like it that much. It sort of slightly grates. I've got a slightly better suggestion, which comes from a friend of mine, a former colleague, who's just completed a PhD on Matthew's Gospel. And he went for a slightly longer description, which I think is really helpful. What does this word blessed mean? He says, those who are on the best possible path in life. What does it mean to be blessed? It means to be on the best possible path in life. So, I think that helps us with application. Let's say a few more words on that. In the first instance, as you read through the sermon holds out a standard. Have a look at the content of this opening part. Verse 3, verse 4, verse 5, verse 6, verse 3. To be poor in spirit. There's the standard. That means to know and accept that we are spiritually bankrupt. There is the standard. Verse 4, to be those who mourn. That means to be consistently moved to a state of tears over our own failures before God. There is the standard. Verse 5, meekness. The surrounding Greek culture at the time would have considered meekness a vice. Jesus says, make it yours. Perfect gentleness, perfect courtesy, self-control. There is the standard. Verse 6, hunger and thirst. We've already spoken about it. A deep longing for righteousness. There is the standard. Jesus says, do that. And of course, that helps us hugely with understanding how this sermon functions. Do it. Jesus doesn't say try your best. He says, do it. And of course, we've only got to spend a moment thinking about any one of those standards to realize you can't. It's impossible. The standard cannot be obtained. And that is the starting point of this sermon. If we set out trying to keep these standards, we will fail. And that is intentional. You see, the attributes of Jesus' kingdom are in the first impossible standards. And there we have the first step to true discipleship. It's a realization of our innate inability to meet the standard. You can't do it. Jesus ends the sermon on the Mount. We'll get there at the end of the academic year in chapter 7. Jesus ends it by saying, do these things. And of course, here we are, even at the beginning, failing to be able to do these things. Now, what that does, of course, is as the first step of discipleship, it leads us to Jesus. It leads us to depend on Jesus. It leads us to cry out to Jesus, which, of course, is exactly what is meant by all of this. But of course, having found that Jesus is the only one that can help us, having shown that we will depend upon Jesus because we can't do this ourselves, well, the sermon has a second function then. You see, it is also, as well as being an impossible standard, it is a standard that is expected by the disciple. It is a standard that's therefore to be applied to the disciple's life. And here's the thing to remember, not a standard to be applied to make us disciples, but a standard that disciples should seek to bring on board in a way to mature, challenge, grow. See, that's what it means to be blessed. That's what it means to be on the best possible path in life. And look at the benefits. Verse 3, the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Verse 4, comfort. Verse 5, shall inherit the earth. Verse 6, satisfaction. You see, that is the underlying attitude. That is the attitude of heart that Jesus says you are to have. And of course, this promises to deliver not just a material earth. I mean, did you see how that's thrown in verse 5? They shall inherit the earth. All the material benefits of this world shall be yours, says Jesus. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Look what's thrown in on top. Verse 4, comfort. Verse 6, satisfaction. And then verse 3, the kingdom of heaven itself. It's everything. My friends, I mean, this is the secret to success. This is the meaning of life in these few verses here. And so, as we begin to draw threads, back to that opening illustration, Jesus says we are to crave righteousness more than air itself, so we should crave righteousness. I'd like to suggest that that is the key attribute that we should be hungering for. That is the key attribute that will shape our attitude, which is what this bit of the sermon is all about. Hunger and thirst for righteousness. So, as we close, what does that actually mean? What does it mean as we head back to our offices or back to our working from home stations, whatever it is? What does it mean to be hungering and thirsting for righteousness? It means, firstly, that we should be desiring more than anything a righteous status before God. There's nothing more important than for God to see you as right, as perfect, because you can't meet his standards yourself. You need him to make you right. Desire that more than anything. Secondly, it means to desire a righteous state for others. The world around us is stuffed without Jesus. More than anything, they need to understand that only Jesus can make them right. That will drive the disciple to take this message, this gospel, to the nations. And thirdly, this righteousness, to deeply desire, to hunger and thirst for righteousness, I think it is to desire a righteous world all around us, a place where justice is truly carried out, where equality is not only realized and spoken about, but experienced. That is an incredible vision, isn't it? To live in a righteous world. And we've only got to spend a moment's thought to realize, of course, that that is not our world. What does that do to the disciple listening in? It drives us to desire above all heaven, because that is the only place where a righteous society will ever dwell. That is the framework that will keep us going. Hunger and thirst for this righteousness, for ourselves, for others, for the world, and that means the world to come. Do you see what this will do? It will drive us to Jesus. It will keep us with Jesus. It will make us speak to others about Jesus and to deeply desire more than anything heaven and the kingdom to come. That is the best possible path in life. Well, a few things to think about, a few things to consider now if you've got time. Tom's going to close our meeting now and to pray as we close, but thank you very much for joining us. And back to Tom.